The key discussion on the agenda of the European Council was climate change, but unfortunately the EU's leaders, our own Taoiseach, Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, they do a very good impression of fiddling while the world burns, because we are hurtling towards an absolute catastrophe. In 30 years, we could have an ice-free Arctic. Those who pay the price will be those in lesser developed countries, will be poor people overwhelmingly. There's a recent report by DARA that suggests that 100 million people could die as a result of climate change by 2030. We have an IPCC report which confirms what we already knew, that the world faces severe, pervasive and irreversible damage from global warming, that human activity is the cause of this, and that drastic action is needed, according to the chairman, to keep a good chance of staying below 2 degrees rising. Our emissions should drop by 40 to 70% globally between 2010 and 2050, falling to zero or below by the year 2100. We need radical action to tackle this. And the EU loves to pose itself as the leading force on climate change across the world. It loves to give itself that image. It's part of a progressive image of the EU that is given within Europe and around the world. But its ambition, its commitments, they're completely miles away from the rhetoric that they use. And so you had a huge row at the European Council about haggling over whether 27% or 30% should be the target for energy efficiency. What we need, obviously, is binding targets, binding regulations to have a 50% cut in greenhouse gases by 2030 and by 80% in 2050. But if you read the conclusions, they're entirely focused on the emissions trading scheme. And the ETS is a failure. And it's not just the left that's saying it's a failure. You can read articles in The Economist or the Financial Times which will tell you that it's a failure. It's a failure from the very start, which saw a massive windfall to some of the biggest polluters within Europe because they received carbon credits and then were able to sell some of them. Electricity utilities, for example, earning between 23 and 71 billion euros in windfall profits in phase 2 alone of the emissions trading scheme. The consequence that the EU uses more coal today than it did in 2007, the highest coal consumption levels since the 1960s. So the ETS is completely, absolutely a failure. It is not an answer to global warming. And it's rooted in the nature of that mechanism, which is about the commodification of pollution, the commodification of nature, which offers opportunities for profits for traders, which they're taking advantage of those opportunities, but no protections for the environment. Because the pollution that is measured, for example, by major polluting corporations, they measure it themselves. And it's not based on they don't actually measure it. It's all nominal. It's all based on estimates. And so they fiddle the figures. It's massive, huge fraud of the emissions trading scheme in order that the polluting companies make even more money. There was a recent report in the journal Climatic Change which said that a mere 90 companies have produced 63% of the cumulative global emissions of industrial carbon dioxide and methane from 1751 to 2010. That includes oil firms like BP, Chevron, Exxon and Shell, and a range of the obvious polluters. What we have is profit-driven global warming, and what we need is system change if we're serious about tackling climate change. One other point, briefly, just to draw attention to the attack on democratic rights that is now in place and will be in place for the next European Council meeting, with the extension of qualified majority voting to over 30 policy areas. This is about a concentration of power within Europe in the hands of a small number of countries in the core, in the centre of Europe. You could now have the majority of governments in the periphery of Europe opposing certain measures, and they'd be overruled by a strong core where you have right-wing governments pushing authoritarian neoliberal direction for the European Union. And just some of those areas are common foreign and security policy, common security and defence policy, and you only need to look to Eastern Europe, to the Ukraine, where you see the reality of an expansionist, imperialist vision for the EU driven by the leaders.